In this video, I want to talk about the microvilli. Okay, those are those little finger-like projections in the lining of the small intestine and how important they are for absorption. And I want to talk about how to protect those, or that we need to protect our microvilli from a few dangerous dietary compounds. And so let's talk about that. Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Minke. This is Minke Wellness. And we've already talked about the microvilli of the small intestine. There's these little finger-like projections that if this were the cell at the lining, right? So we'd have this cell here, and then another cell here, making the lining. Here would be the lining of the intestine. Well, what we've got are little finger-like projections that stick out into the lumen, and you can see how that would increase our surface area for absorption tremendously. So it's really important for our absorption that these little microvilli stay intact, okay? So there are some things that would produce or create would threaten the health of these microvilli, okay? So let's talk about two compounds in particular. The first, you've heard me talk about before, it is trans fats, okay? These crooked plasticized fat, okay, these partially hydrogenated vegetable oil that go in and mess up the membranes of the cells, of every cell in the body. So it's affecting every cell in the body, but it's particularly affecting the microvilli because that membrane has to be fluid and has to move. And when the partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, that little bent fat molecule gets in there, it causes the membranes to be stiff. Well, now all of a sudden we don't get the absorption, and we lose absorption in particular, and this has been studied in sports medicine, that we actually start to lose absorption of amino acids when we eat in the diet, when we eat partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. So it's very important that we eliminate this from our diet, and we've been talking about this for 3 months now. So hopefully you have taken it seriously that you need to get rid of the partially hydrogenated vegetable oil trans fat type of scenario that's in the food. Now, just to remind you that partially hydrogenated vegetable oil is in a lot of prepared foods, but it is basically, when you see these spreads, that's margarine. Margarine is like 100% partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, so you don't want that stuff at all. You're better off with the butter. Okay, so now we talk about another class of compounds that has gotten a lot of attention, and it's gluten. Okay, and here's where, for example, my daughter is gluten gluten sensitive. I mean, if she eats regular whole wheat, even if it's organic whole wheat, organic wheat products, she reacts, okay, and she gets a big rash all over her neck and throat and face, and we have to give her apis, homeopathic apis, and give her enzymes and some sulfurzyme, and it helps that reaction, and the chewable enzymes, the kids' chewable enzymes. So the interesting thing is, when we switch to einkorn wheat, okay, so what's the difference? Well, the other regular, what we call commercial regular wheat, has been hybridized. It's been crossed, mated with another form of wheat that we would never have eaten, and so what they did was shorten it and make bigger grains, and so it made it more commercially viable. But that product really isn't a food product. It wasn't ever designed. It wasn't made by nature to be a food product. We altered it to create what we consider a food product. And I'll explain a little bit that this is bad in the form of lectins as well. We'll get that in a second. But so we have this gluten that's a protein that some people, it's very sticky, and some people don't tolerate it very well, don't digest it. Some people can digest it just fine. So this is not a problem for everyone, but there are some people who cannot. So interestingly, this hybridized wheat, Hannah cannot tolerate. But the einkorn, the original, 3 foot tall, golden waves of grain, and I mean, the original wheat that goes back to ancient times, she can eat that with no problem. I mean, she can have an entire 2 pancakes of organic einkorn wheat pancakes and have no problem. So the question is, does the einkorn contain gluten? Yes, it does. It contains gluten. It's 1/8 the amount of gluten. But we're not talking about amount of gluten here, because she'll react with even the tiniest amount of the regular wheat gluten. And here she is eating 2 whole pancakes. So clearly, in her, these 2 glutens are not the same, right? This is proof to me. Here's one example of absolute proof that the wheat gluten in the hybrid is not the same kind of gluten. It's not the same issue. It's a whole different kind of protein than the wheat gluten that's in the einkorn wheat. So I highly recommend that everyone switch to einkorn wheat as best you can. Okay, now I realize I'm not talking about going gluten-free. That is not the requirement. If you have a gluten problem, then you're going to need to go gluten-free. But I'm not talking about going gluten-free. I'm talking about switching any of your wheat products to organic whole grain. I always still like the whole grain for the fiber content. Organic whole grain einkorn wheat. Okay, now here's where I'm going to get some arguments from people and say, well, I thought we were not going to have any grain. Everything has to be paleo. And this whole argument about paleo is starting to bring up the discussion of lectins. So let me clarify that word. Lectin, lectin. Lectins are a broad class of compounds that are found in both. It's a plant compound, but it ends up in the tissues of animals who eat those plants. Okay, so we've got a problem with both sides, but it is a plant compound. Okay. And it is a broad class of compounds that plants often will use to defend against being eaten. So they tend, not all of them, but many of them tend to be designed, literally sort of designed by the plant to irritate and compromise your digestive tract. Okay, here's where we come back to the microvilli. Oh, I didn't mention why the gluten is bad on the microvilli. They tend to glom up. It's very glutinous. It's the gluten. Wheat gluten, back to that just briefly, is that it will actually gum up and get on top of the microvilli and basically prevent just a physical blockage. And if you stop eating the wheat and take some enzymes, you can clear that out. Now, so back to the lectin. So these lectins will actually bind sugar compounds. And those sugar compounds are often on the outsides, receptor sites, and on the outsides of cells. And so we end up getting agglutination. These things come in and glom onto cells and block the microvilli, so that again we're not getting good absorption. They will also affect the not just the absorption, but they actually affect the environment in the gut, and will cause an overgrowth of the unwanted microbes. And it ends up with what they call leaky gut, where the lining gets irritated and starts to break down, and then you get these undigested products and food stuff gets into the bloodstream. Now here's where the lectins then get into the bloodstream, and they circulate and get into other tissues, and they start attaching themselves to the thyroid and the pancreas and other kinds of things. And here's where an overactive immune system will come in and start to just chomp on these foreign proteins that are, and then of course once they start chomping on the protein, they end up chomping on the organ that it's attached to. So we end up with the thyroid problems, autoimmune thyroid, autoimmune pancreas problems, et cetera, et cetera. So this sounds like an absolute nightmare. Okay, now let me back up a little bit and say that lectins from non-food sources, okay, tend to be very, very bad and very nasty, and that's basically like you going out in the forest, just picking up random vegetable material, random leaves, and start chewing on them. These are not food items, right? So these contain lectins that are probably very toxic and will really upset your digestive system. These are the lectins I'm really talking about. Now, as we switch over to food items, you start to realize that we as humans have selected those plants that have relatively low and non-toxic lectins. So if we are eating food, we've already kind of biased our selection toward those plants that have lectins that we tolerate or that have low lectin content. Okay. Now, there are obviously foods with higher lectin contents, and then you actually start to realize that, when beans have higher lectin content, well, we don't eat raw beans. What do? We soak them, we cook them, and so when the soaking and cooking process actually breaks down those lectins, and so then we've solved the problem. And so we all go back to grandma's methods, and we know this, okay? And you've heard me say this. If you haven't, I'm going to say it here. We would all be much better off as a society to turn the clock back 100 years on our food supply and only eat things that we could have gotten 100 years ago. And that means that we have to go back and source our heirloom plants, because we've done all this hybridization and all this selection and all this other stuff. So grapes are now the size of plums. Plums are now the size of oranges. Oranges are now the size of grapefruits, right? This is ridiculous. I mean, these things were never meant to be like this. They're never meant to be this sack of sugar. They're meant to be small. And so if you're gonna buy your fruits and vegetables, your berries, etc., choose the ones that are literally smaller. Choose apples that are smaller. Choose oranges that are smaller. Don't buy the mega size thing, because that's just the same amount of nutrients, but with a lot more sugar. Okay, so back to lectins. I'm running out of time, and lectins are an extremely complicated discussion, and it doesn't do it justice for anyone to kind of glibly say we should avoid all lectins. That's absurd. You can't do it. But we can start looking at things. If you're getting irritated by certain food products and certain food sources, it may be a lectin issue. But here's the problem with modern food, okay? We start monkeying around, and here's where GMO products, they've come in and they've actually spliced lectins from other plants that are non-food plants into our tomatoes and other things for the purpose of creating an antifungal. In other words, there are other plants that produce these lectins that are natural antifungals, and so they splice these into our tomatoes so that it's an antifungal, so it doesn't go bad and sits on the shelf for 6 months. But these are lectins that we would never eat. So this is no longer a food product. This is a problem I have with this GMO garbage and this mentality that with our technology, we can improve the food. Oh, that is such junk. I mean, I would use other expletives, but not here. And I get so frustrated with this concept okay, so anyway, what I'm saying is try to do the best you can to turn the clock back. You can't trust organic anymore, because even the strain of tomato that they're using has already been altered. Hopefully it's non-GMO, but I don't know that I trust. It's so hard to trust this stuff anymore. I do the best I can, okay? I eat everything organic. Now, here's the thing. If you're going to eat meat, you need to try to get grass-fed meat, because the grain-fed meat has all these lectins in it, especially from foods that are not foods. Now, I'm going to point out two items that we do this to. Cottonseed. We were never meant to eat cottonseed, and yet we have cottonseed products, cottonseed oil that we put into our food supply. And the other is rapeseed. You don't probably know the word rapeseed. It's canola oil. Okay, canola oil is from rapeseed. This is not a food product. So when we start identifying, and this is where I'm not so sure about hemp. A lot of people are going crazy over hemp, and I'm like, that is not really a food supply. I don't know that we would ever have chosen hemp as a food. Maybe cultures have, but I'm kind of wary of things that are really not in our food dictionary, so to speak, and say, oh, just because there's that we can get protein out of hemp seeds, that doesn't mean we should. So anyway, I don't know. I'm not saying there's any problem with hemp, but it's one of those things but I know canola oil and rapeseed are definitely not food products, and yet we produce these food products from them. We change the name for them, so we don't call it rapeseed, we call it canola oil, and now these lectins are leaking into the system. That are, again, from plants that we would never have eaten, okay? And these are these lectins that end up causing problems. Now, there's two ways to defend against lectins. One, reduce their influence by not taking them or deactivating them, cooking them, all that kind of stuff. You can do those things. And then the other one is keep your immune system under control. An overactive immune system is going to overreact to these lectins and create problems. And I'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the immune system in a couple months. But this is an issue. We've got to keep our immune system under control. And we have out of control immune systems. And this is the problem. Our immune systems are overreacting to these things. Okay, so I know this has been almost a depressing amount of information about diet things. But let's just do our best we can, but again, we try to go back to as natural as we can, try to turn the clock back as best you can, and eat real food, okay? That's really, it solves all the problems here of all these other complex discussions, okay? Hang in there. Happy wellness. We'll see you tomorrow.